The Fox News studio in Midtown Manhattan hummed with the specific, high-voltage electricity that only precedes a public execution. Not a physical one, of course, but something far more brutal in the arena of modern politics: the death of a narrative. The air conditioning was set to a frigid 65 degrees, a standard requirement for television, designed to keep the sweat off the faces of liars. But tonight, the temperature felt like a warning. Inside the control room, 20 monitors flickered with the feeds from cameras positioned like snipers, ready to catch every twitch, every bead of perspiration, every microsecond of hesitation. The producers knew what was coming. They had seen the pre-debate filings. They knew this wasn't going to be a debate. It was going to be an autopsy performed on a living career. High above the stage, the studio lights blazed down, illuminating two podiums that stood like islands in a dark sea. To the left, the podium reserved for the darling of the progressive left. To the right, the station for the soldier. Backstage, in green room A, the atmosphere was choking. It smelled of expensive hairspray, nervous sweat, and the distinct, metallic scent of panic masquerading as arrogance. Ilhan Omar sat in a plush leather chair, her eyes darting between 3 different iPhones laid out on the coffee table before her. She was surrounded by a phalanx of handlers, the modern Praetorian Guard of the Democratic Party. For staffers were frantically typing on Blackberries and tablets, their thumbs moving in a blur of damage control before the damage had even happened. Stick to the racism angle, a 20-something communications director with a messy bun and a tremulous voice said, not looking up from her screen. If she pivots to the marriage documents, you pivot to xenophobia. It's the kill switch. It works every time. Omar didn't respond immediately. She was adjusting the cuffs of a designer blazer that retailed for more than the average Somali family earned in a decade. She looked at her reflection in the illuminated vanity mirror, checking the angle of her turquoise hijab. It had to be perfect. It was her armor. It was her shield. For years, she had wielded her identity like a cudgel, bludgeoning anyone who dared to question her ethics into a submissive silence. She's a Fox News favorite, Omar muttered, her voice tight, lacking its usual melodic cadence she reserved for CNN interviews. They're going to rig the questions. Martha is going to try to trap me. That's why you don't answer the questions, Congresswoman. A crisis consultant in a sharp gray suit interjected, leaning over her shoulder. He smelled of tobacco and expensive cologne. You answer the motivation. If they ask about the tax returns, you ask why they're obsessed with a successful Muslim woman. You attack the premise. You make them the problem. Tulsi is desperate. She's polling at 0. She's a Russian asset. Use that. Call her a traitor. Omar nodded, a tight, artificial smile stretching across her face. A traitor. Yes, that was the line. Project the treason onto the veteran. It was the classic maneuver of the modern left. Accuse your enemy of exactly what you were doing. She picked up her notes. They were light on facts, but heavy on rhetoric. Words like bigotry, systemic oppression, and Islamophobia were highlighted in neon yellow. This wasn't a debate strategy. It was a script for moral superiority. She had survived campaign finance scandals before. She had survived the anti-Semitic tweets. She had survived the whispers about her brother. She had survived because the media protected her, because the party protected her, and because no one, absolutely no one, had ever had the courage to look her in the eye and read the receipts out loud. She thought she was walking into a debate. She didn't realize she was walking into a court-martial. Down the hall, in Green Room B, the silence was absolute. There were no frantic staffers, no crisis consultants spinning narratives, no phones buzzing with notifications from panicked donors. Tulsi Gabbard sat alone on a simple folding chair, her back straight, her feet planted flat on the floor in a posture of military readiness. On the table in front of her, there was no makeup kit. There was only a single, beat-up iPad and a stack of manila folders, the edges worn from use. She wasn't looking at herself in the mirror. She was reading. Her eyes scanned the documents for the 100th time, absorbing the details with the cold, analytical precision of a field medic assessing a wound. The marriage license from 2009. The divorce decree from 2017. The tax filings from the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board. The flight logs. the transfer records to the E Street Group. It was all there, a roadmap of corruption so blatant, so arrogant, that it was almost insulted her intelligence. Tulsi reached out and touched the American flag pin on her lapel. It wasn't a prop. It wasn't a costume piece worn to pull well with the demographics in the Rust Belt. It was a piece of metal that represented the blood of friends she had lost in the sand. It represented the oath she had taken, an oath that the woman in the other room treated like a suggestion. She closed the folder. The sound was sharp, like the racking of slide on a service weapon. The door opened, and a production assistant poked his head in, looking terrified. 5 minutes to air, Major, Congresswoman. Tulsi stood up. She didn't check her hair. She didn't practice a smile. She picked up the stack of folders, tucked the iPad under her arm, and walked to the door. Her movements were economic, fluid. The walk of someone who had moved under fire and learned that hesitation is the only sin that gets you killed. "Ready," she said. Her voice was calm, dangerously calm. The hallway leading to the stage was a tunnel of blinding light. As Omar stepped out first, the studio audience erupted. It was a curated noise. The section to the left, filled with young progressives in the squad, merchandise, cheered with a frenetic, almost desperate energy. They were loud, but their eyes were anxious. They knew the rumors. They knew the internet had been digging. Omar waved, flashing that practiced, dazzling smile. She walked with the swagger of a celebrity, soaking in the adulation, deliberately ignoring the stony silence from the right side of the room. She took her place behind the podium, arranging her notes, taking a sip of water, performing the theater of confidence. She looked at Martha McCallum, the moderator, and gave a nod that said, "I own this room." Then Tulsi Gabbard walked out. The applause from the right side of the room was different. It wasn't the high-pitched screaming of fans. It was the deep, guttural roar of respect. Men in VFW hats stood up. Women in Gold Star family shirts clapped with tears in their eyes. It was a thunderous, grounding sound that seemed to shake the floorboards. Tulsi didn't wave. She didn't smile for the cameras. She walked to her podium with a stride that measured the distance to the target. She placed her folders down. She placed her iPad down. And then she turned and looked directly at Ilhan Omar. It wasn't a glare. It was an inspection. For a split second, across the stage, their eyes locked. Omar's smile faltered. Just for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression that the 4K cameras caught in high definition. Her eyes widened, her pupil dilating. It was the primal recognition of a predator realizing it is no longer the top of the food chain. Omar looked at the stack of folders on Tulsi's podium. She saw the tabs. She saw the thickness of the evidence. And for the first time in her political career, Ilhan Omar felt the cold hand of fear grip her throat. Martha McCallum sat at the center desk, shuffling her index cards. She looked composed, a veteran anchor, but her knuckles were white. She could feel the tension radiating from the two women like heat off a tarmac. This wasn't just a clash of policies, it was a collision of worlds. The world of performative outrage versus the world of duty. "Good evening," Martha said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Welcome to the Fox News special debate. Tonight, we are here to discuss the future of the Democratic Party, foreign policy, and the integrity of our representation in Congress." The red light on camera one glowed like a demonic eye. Millions of Americans were watching at home, in bars, in living rooms, in barracks overseas. "We will begin with opening statements," Martha continued. "But first, a question on the nature of political discourse. Congresswoman Omar, you have frequently stated that your critics are motivated by bigotry. Tonight, you face a fellow Democrat, a woman of color, and a combat veteran. Is it your position that any criticism from this stage tonight is also hate speech?" It was a trap, a beautiful, elegant trap right out of the gate. Omar leaned into the microphone. She didn't hesitate. She went straight to the script. "Martha," she began, her voice dropping to a register of sorrowful indignation. "It is not about who asks the questions. It is about the system that emboldens them. I am a survivor. I am a refugee. And I stand here tonight not just for myself, but for every marginalized voice that has been told to go back to where they came from. And it is tragic, truly tragic, that some of my own party have chosen to align themselves with the forces of division, with the warmongers, with the people who built their careers on the suffering of Muslims. She turned her head slowly, theatrically, to look at Tulsi. People who claim to serve, but who actually serve the machinery of death. People like Tulsi Gabbard. The studio gasped. It was audible. She had gone there. In the first 90 seconds, she had effectively called a soldier a murderer. Omar smirked. She thought she had landed a knockout blow. She thought she had framed the narrative. She thought she was safe. Tulsi didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She simply reached out with her left hand and opened the first manila folder. The sound of the paper turning was amplified by her microphone, a dry, crisp gay. She looked down at the document, then up at Omar. Her face was a mask of stone. "You rehearsed that," Tulsi said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to the back of the room without effort. "You practiced that line in the mirror. You thought it would shame me. You thought it would make me defend myself." Tulsi leaned forward, resting her elbows on the podium. "But you forgot one thing, Congresswoman. I don't answer to you. I answer to the truth. And unfortunately for you." Tulsi tapped the stack of papers. "I brought it with me." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with violence. The war had begun. The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke. Machinery of death. It was a phrase polling tested in faculty lounges and progressive think tanks, designed to sound profound while actually being grotesque. For 3 seconds, the studio was absolutely silent. It wasn't the silence of boredom. It was the silence of a car crash before the glass settles. Martha McCallum opened her mouth to intervene, to steer the ship back to the safety of policy nuance, but Tulsi raised a hand. A small, sharp gesture. "Stop." Tulsi didn't look angry. That was what terrified the producers in the booth. If she had yelled, if she had shown outrage, it would have been a fight. But she didn't yell. She smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of expression a sniper wears when the wind dies down and the target stops moving. "Congresswoman Omar," Tulsi said, her voice dropping an octave, forcing the audience to lean in. "You just called a combat veteran a war criminal on national television. You called the United States military the machinery of death." She paused, letting the words echo. "That is a bold strategy. Stupid but bold." Omar bristled, her posture stiffening. "I am speaking truth to power, Tulsi. I am speaking for the victims of American imperialism who—" "No." Tulsi cut her off. The word was like a whip crack. "You're not speaking for victims. You're speaking for your brand. You're reciting a pamphlet." Tulsi stepped out from behind her podium. It was a violation of the debate rules, a physical breach of the agreed-upon staging. The camera operators scrambled to adjust focus. She walked to the center of the stage, leaving her notes behind. She didn't need them for this. This wasn't data. This was blood. "I serve in a medical unit in Iraq," Tulsi said, addressing the audience directly, ignoring Omar for a moment. "I didn't carry a rifle to conquer. I carried a medical bag. We treated American soldiers whose bodies were torn apart by IEDs planted by the terrorists you make excuses for. We treated Iraqi civilians, men, women, children, who were butchered by al-Qaeda because they dared to want to vote. We saved lives. We washed the blood of innocent people off our hands every single night." She turned slowly on her heel to face Omar. The distance between them felt like miles. "That is what I did. I cleaned up the mess. I tried to sew people back together." Tulsi's eyes narrowed. "And while I was doing that, what were you doing?" "You were sitting in a classroom in North Dakota, enjoying the safety that my friends died to provide you, and learning how to articulate why America is the problem." Omar gripped the sides of her podium. Her knuckles were white against the wood. "I will not be lectured on morality by someone who launders the reputation of the military-industrial complex. My perspective is valid. I have seen the consequences of war." "You've seen war on television," Tulsi replied, her voice dangerously soft. "I've smelled it." Tulsi walked back to her podium and tapped the screen of her iPad. "But since you brought up the topic of victims, and since you seem so concerned with how we describe violence, Let's look at how you describe the deadliest attack in American history. Tulsi nodded to the control room. Roll the tape. The massive LED screen behind them, which had been displaying a neutral blue background, suddenly flickered to life. The image was grainy, handheld footage from a CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, fundraiser in March 2019. There was Ilhan Omar on the screen, standing at a podium not unlike the one she stood at now. She looked relaxed, comfortable among friends. Her voice boomed through the studio speakers, magnified by the high-end sound system. CARE was founded after September 11th because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. The clip ended. The screen froze on Omar's face mid-shrug, a casual, dismissive gesture, as if she were talking about a parking ticket or a minor weather event. Some people did something. The air left the room. In the studio audience, the veterans section went rigid. A man in the second row, wearing a Vietnam vet hat, crossed his arms so tightly his biceps bulged. The sheer disrespect of the phrase, hearing it again, amplified in high definition, was a physical blow. Tulsi let the silence stretch. She let it become uncomfortable. She let it become painful. Some people, Tulsi repeated. She tasted the words, spitting them out like spoiled meat. Did something. She looked at Omar, who was now staring straight ahead, her jaw set, refusing to look at the screen behind her. September 11th, 2001, Tulsi continued, her cadence rhythmic, hammering. 19 hijackers, Al-Qaeda terrorists, motivated by a jihadist ideology that wants to eradicate our way of life. They flew planes into the World Trade Center, into the Pentagon, into a field in Pennsylvania. Tulsi's voice rose, vibrating with controlled fury. 2,977 Americans were murdered in a single morning. Firefighters crushed, secretaries vaporized, people holding hands and jumping from the 100th floor because burning to death was the only other option. She pointed a finger at the frozen image on the screen. And you describe that as some people did something? It is out of context. Omar shouted, her voice shrill, cracking under the pressure. She leaned into the mic, desperate to regain the floor. I was speaking about the loss of civil liberties. I was speaking about how Muslims were targeted after the attack. This is exactly what I mean. You picked 3 words to demonize me. The context makes it worse. Tulsi shot back, overriding her. Because in your mind, the tragedy of 9/11 wasn't the dead Americans. In your mind, the tragedy was that people started looking at you differently. Tulsi picked up a piece of paper from her folder. I have the full transcript right here. You spent 20 minutes talking about your victimhood. You spent 0 minutes acknowledging the horror of the attack itself. You dismissed the murder of 3,000 of your fellow citizens as a vague, inconvenient event. A footnote. I am an American. Omar yelled. I have the right to critique. You have the right, Tulsi interrupted. And we have the right to be disgusted by it. Tulsi walked around the podium again, closing the distance. She was talking now. Here is the reality, Congresswoman. You came to this country as a refugee. You were 12 years old. You fled Somalia, a place broken by warlords, by tribal violence, by the exact kind of extremism that attacked us on September 11th. America took you in. We didn't ask for your money. We didn't ask for your pedigree. We gave you a home. We gave you an education. We gave you the freedom to run for Congress. Tulsi stopped 5 feet from Omar. She looked up at the taller woman, her eyes blazing. And how do you repay that generosity? You minimize our pain. You mock our tragedy. You stand there in your designer clothes, enjoying the protection of the very military you call a machinery of death, and you refer to the mass murder of our citizens as some people did something. Omar's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was watching her talking points incinerate in real time. The Islamophobia card was in her hand, but she couldn't play it. How do you call someone Islamophobic for quoting your own words about 9/11? The logic didn't hold. The circuit was broken. I enlisted because of that day, Tulsi said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a scream. I put on a uniform because I saw those towers fall. I saw the ash cover New York. I felt the heartbreak of a nation. I wanted to protect this country. She gestured to the screen, where Omar's dismissive shrug was still frozen, looming over them like a ghost. You look at that same day, and you see an inconvenience. You see an excuse to play the victim. Tulsi turned back to the audience. The camera zoomed in on her face, stoic, fierce, unyielding. So, America has a choice to make. Who do you trust? The soldier who ran toward the fire to defend you? Or the politician who can't even bring herself to name the enemy that wants to kill you? This is character assassination. Omar finally managed to sputter, her voice shaking. You are inciting violence against me. You are weaponizing. I am quoting you. Tulsi snapped, turning back with lightning speed. If your own words are character assassination, Ilhan, then maybe you should examine your character. The applause started slowly. One person in the back, then another, then the entire right side of the room stood up. It wasn't polite applause. It was a release of tension. It was the sound of millions of people finally hearing someone say what they had been screaming at their television screens for 5 years. Martha McCallum tried to bang her gavel, but it was useless. The narrative had shifted. The ground had broken. Backstage, Omar's campaign manager threw his headset onto the table. Cut the feed. He hissed at a monitor that couldn't hear him. Go to commercial. Get her out of there. But the red light stayed on. Tulsi wasn't done. She walked back to her podium, her movements deliberate. She closed the folder labeled 9/11 and moved it to the side. She reached for the next one. This one was thicker. It had a black tab. Now, Tulsi said, as the applause died down into a terrified hush. You mentioned that I was attacking your identity. You said I was attacking your faith. She opened the black folder. Let's talk about how you treat the faith of others. Let's talk about the Jews. Omar's eyes widened. She swallowed hard, the movement visible in her throat. She had expected the 9/11 attack. She had prepared for it. But she hadn't expected the pivot to be so fast, so seamless. Tulsi looked at the camera, a cold smile touching her lips. Martha, if we're done discussing some people, I think it's time we discuss the Benjamins. The screen behind the podiums blinked. The frozen image of the 9/11 shrug vanished, replaced instantly by a stark, white background. In the center, blown up to the size of a billboard, was a single tweet. Ilhan Omar, at Ilhan, February 10th, 2019, it's all about the Benjamins' baby musical notes. The musical note emoji at the end of the sentence seemed to mock the gravity of the room. It was playful. It was flippant. It was the digital equivalent of a wink and a nudge. Let's talk about currency, Tulsi said. She didn't look at the screen. She knew what was there. She looked at the woman who wrote it. Specifically, let's talk about the currency of hate. Omar shifted her weight, leaning away from the screen as if it were radiating heat. This is old news, she said, waving a manicured hand dismissively. I have apologized. I have clarified. This is a distraction from real policy debates about the Middle East. It's not a distraction, Tulsi countered, her voice sharp. It's a diagnosis. Tulsi walked around the front of her podium, engaging the audience again. For those watching at home who don't speak Twitter, Tulsi said, let me translate. This was Congresswoman Omar's response to a question about why American politicians support Israel. She didn't cite shared democratic values. She didn't cite strategic alliances. She didn't cite the fact that Israel is the only free democracy in a region of dictatorships. Tulsi pointed a finger back at the screen. She said it's about the money. The Benjamins, $100 bills. Jewish money buying American control. That is a distortion. Omar interrupted, her voice rising in pitch. I was criticizing the lobbying industry. AIPAC, the influence of money in politics is a real issue. Tulsi, or are you too bought and paid for to admit it? Tulsi laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. Nice try, Tulsi said, but we know what you meant, and we know why you said it that way. She signaled the control room again. The image changed. Another tweet, older this time, from 2012. Ilhan Omar, at Ilhan, November 16th, 2012, Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. Hypnotized, Tulsi read the word aloud. Not lobby, not persuaded. Hypnotized. She turned to Omar, her eyes locking on her target. That is not policy criticism, Ilhan. That is a conspiracy theory from the Middle Ages. The idea that Jews possess some mystical, magical power to mind control the masses. That they are puppeteers pulling the strings of the world. You didn't invent that line. You borrowed it from the protocols of the elders of Zion. The studio was dead silent. The accusation was devastating. Tulsi wasn't just calling her rude. She was linking her rhetoric to the darkest chapters of human history. I was talking about the media narrative. Omar stammered, sweat beginning to glisten on her forehead under the studio lights. I was young. I was expressing frustration with the Gaza war. You are twisting my words to paint me as a bigot because I am a Muslim. Stop hiding behind your religion, Tulsi snapped. This isn't about you being Muslim. This is about you being a bigot. Tulsi walked back to her podium and picked up the black folder. She opened it, scanning the page. You want to talk about context? Let's try a hypothetical. I want to see if you can spot the problem. Tulsi looked directly into camera 2, addressing the millions of viewers. If I stood on this stage right now and said, the problem with the inner cities is that it's all about the welfare. Baby, what would you call me? She turned back to Omar. Ilhan, what would you call me? Omar froze. Her mouth opened, then closed. She knew the trap. If she answered, she lost. If she stayed silent, she lost. I'll answer for you, Tulsi said, her voice hard as granite. You would call me a racist, and you would be right, because I would be using a lazy, hateful stereotype to attack an entire group of struggling people. I would be reducing their humanity to a check. Tulsi slammed the folder shut. But when you say Jews are all about the Benjamins, when you say they have hypnotized the world, when you question the dual loyalty of Jewish Americans, accusing them of serving Israel over the United States, you call it policy criticism. You call it speaking truth to power. Tulsi leaned over the podium. That's the double standard, Ilhan. You demand protection for your identity while you weaponize identity against everyone else. Omar looked frantic now. She looked at Martha McCallum. Martha, are you going to let her smear me like this? This is Islamophobia. She is equating legitimate criticism of a state actor with. The House of Representatives condemned you. Tulsi interrupted, her voice booming over Omar's protests. That is not true. Omar shouted. It is a matter of public record. Tulsi fired back. March 2019. House Resolution 183. Another graphic appeared on the screen. It was the text of the resolution, condemning anti-Semitism as hateful expressions of intolerance. Your own party, Tulsi said, pointing at the document. Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, the Democratic leadership, they were so embarrassed, so ashamed of your comments, that they had to pass a resolution condemning anti-Semitism just to clean up your mess. They didn't name you because they were too cowardly to put your name in ink, but everyone in that chamber knew who it was for. It was the Ilhan Omar cleanup bill. Tulsi paused, letting the humiliation sink in. Think about that. You are so toxic that your own colleagues, people who desperately want to support you, had to officially go on record to say, we don't agree with the hate she is spewing. Omar was shaking her head violently. They were bullied by the right wing. They caved to pressure. I've been consistent in my fight for human rights. Human rights? Tulsi raised an eyebrow. You compare Israel, a democracy, to the Taliban, to Hamas, to Nazi Germany. She pulled another sheet from the folder. Here is a quote from you. You said that we must have the same level of accountability for the United States and Israel as we do for Hamas and the Taliban. Tulsi looked at the audience with genuine disbelief. Hamas, a terrorist organization that beheads children, that rapes women as a weapon of war, that uses its own people as human shields, and you think they are morally equivalent to the United States and Israel. I said we must have equal application of international law. Omar yelled, her voice screeching now. The composure was gone. The cool, squad girl aesthetic had dissolved into panic. No, Tulsi said calmly. You equated the firefighter with the arsonist. And you did it because you fundamentally believe that the West is evil and that the terrorists are just misunderstood victims. Tulsi took a step back, her posture relaxing slightly, signaling a shift from attack to judgment. You know, Ilhan, there's a profound irony here. Jewish refugees came to this country fleeing genocide, fleeing the Holocaust. 6 million of them murdered because of the exact same conspiracy theories you tweet about. Jews control the money. Jews control the world. Jews aren't loyal to their country. Tulsi's voice softened, becoming almost sad. They came here for safety, just like you did. They built lives here. They contributed to this nation. And now, they have to turn on the television and see a sitting member of Congress recycling the propaganda that killed their grandparents. I'm not a Nazi. Omar screamed. It was a visceral reaction. The word hung in the air. I didn't call you a Nazi, Tulsi said quietly. I said you used their talking points. The distinction was surgical. It cut deeper than the insult. Tulsi looked at Martha. Martha, she can't defend the tweets because they are indefensible. She can't explain the House resolution because it proves her own party doesn't trust her. All she has is the victim card. And tonight, that card has been declined. We need to move on, Martha McCallum said, her voice shaky. She sensed the room was on the verge of exploding. The audience was in a frenzy. The producers were screaming in her earpiece. Ratings are through the roof. Keep them going. Don't stop it. Yes, Tulsi agreed, closing the black folder. She placed it on top of the 9/11 folder. The stack was growing, a physical tower of evidence. Let's move on. We've talked about your hatred of America. We've talked about your hatred of Jews. Tulsi reached for a new folder. This one was red. Bright, alarm bell red. Now, let's talk about something much more personal. Something you've spent millions of dollars trying to hide. Omar saw the red folder. Her eyes locked onto it. Backstage, the crisis consultant stopped pacing. He stared at the monitor, his face draining of color. Oh God, he whispered. She has the immigration file. On stage, Tulsi Gabbard didn't smile. She just opened the folder. Let's talk about your family, Ilhan. Or should I say, your husband's. The room didn't just go quiet, it went dead. It was the kind of silence usually reserved for funerals or the reading of a terminal diagnosis. The red folder lay open on Tulsi Gabbard's podium like a wound. Immigration, Tulsi said, the word hanging in the frigid air. It is the bedrock of your political identity, Ilhan. You lecture us on borders. You demand we abolish ICE. You call anyone who believes in the rule of law a xenophobe. She looked down at the documents, then up at Omar. The look was pitying. But the question isn't about your politics. It's about your entry. Omar's face had gone ashen. The confident, turquoise-clad warrior of the left had vanished. In her place stood a woman who looked like she was waiting for the police to kick down her door. She gripped the podium so hard the wood creaked. My personal life is not up for debate, Omar whispered, her voice barely registering on the microphone. This is below the belt. This is. Your personal life became public interest the moment you filed fraudulent tax returns, Tulsi cut in, her voice slicing through the studio. And it became a matter of national security the moment you potentially defrauded the United States government to get a family member into this country. Tulsi signaled the control room. Put up the timeline. The screen behind them shifted. The tweet was gone. In its place was a complex, tangled graphic. It looked less like a marriage history and more like a wire fraud schematic. Let's walk through this, Tulsi said, stepping to the side so the camera could capture the full insanity of the dates. She used a laser pointer, the red dot dancing across the years. 2002, you apply for a marriage license with Ahmed Hirsi, the father of your children. You don't legally marry him, but you live with him. You have a family. The red up moved. 2009, you suddenly marry a man named Ahmed Nur Said Elmi, a British citizen. Tulsi turned to the audience. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In 2011, while you're legally married to Mr. Elmi, you're living back with Mr. Hirsi. You're filing joint tax returns with Mr. Hirsi. You are having children with Mr. Hirsi. The laser stopped on the name Elmi. Who is Ahmed Nur Said Elmi? Ilhan? Omar's eyes were darting around the room, looking for an exit, looking for a friendly face. There were none. Even her supporters in the audience were staring at the screen, trying to do the math. The math didn't work. He was my husband, Omar said, her voice trembling. It was a difficult time. It was a private matter. We separated. Culturally, We were divorced. Culturally, Tulsi scoffed. The IRS doesn't care about your culture, Ilhan. They care about the law. But let's look closer at Mr. Elmi. Tulsi dropped the laser pointer and walked back to her podium. She picked up a photograph from the red folder and held it up to the camera. It was a grainy, black and white picture from the 1990s. This is a school record from Somalia, Tulsi said. It lists the students. It lists their parents. She held up a second document. This is your marriage license. She held up a third. This is a social media post from 2013, before you scrub your history. Tulsi laid them out like a royal flush. The evidence strongly suggests, that Ahmed Nursaid Elmi is not just your ex-husband. She looked directly into Omar's eyes. The predator closing in for the kill. He is your brother. The gas from the audience was audible. It sucked the oxygen out of the room. Incest. The word wasn't spoken, but it screamed in everyone's mind. That is a lie. Omar shrieked. It was a sound of pure terror. That is a disgusting, racist, right-wing conspiracy theory. You are obsessed with my bloodline. You are obsessed because I am Somali. Then prove it wrong, Tulsi said. Her voice was calm, contrasting sharply with Omar's hysteria. What? Omar blinked. Prove it wrong. Tulsi leaned forward. If this is a lie, Ilhan, is the easiest lie in the world to disprove. You don't need a speech. You don't need to cry about racism. You need one sheet of paper. Tulsi held up a finger. Show us his birth certificate. The real one. She held up a second finger. Show us his immigration entry forms. She held up a third finger. Take a DNA test. The room was frozen. If he is your husband and not your brother, a simple DNA swab clears this up in 24 hours. You could end this conspiracy theory tonight. You could humiliate me right now by producing the evidence. Tulsi paused. She looked at Omar's hands, which were shaking uncontrollably. But you won't, and you can't. I don't have to dignify this garbage with a response. Omar spat back, tried to regain her footing. I answer to my constituents, not to internet trolls. You answer to the law. Tulsi slammed her hand on the podium. The sudden noise made the cameraman jump. Let's talk about the law, since you clearly don't care about the morality. Tulsi pulled a document with an official government seal. It was the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board investigation. Forget the brother for a second. Let's look at the fraud you admitted to. She waved the paper. In 2014 and 2015, you filed joint tax returns with Ahmed Hersi, but you were legally married to Ahmed Elmi. Tulsi looked at the camera. For everyone watching at home, if you file a joint tax return with someone who is not your legal spouse, that is a felony. That is tax fraud. That is perjury. She turned back to Omar. You were investigated. And what happened? You paid a fine. Tulsi read from the document. $3,469. You paid the fine to the Campaign Finance Board to make the problem go away. You paid for the silence. I corrected a filing error. Omar protested. It was a mistake by my accountant. An accountant doesn't accidentally marry you to your brother, Ilhan. Tulsi fired back. The audience erupted. Half of them were laughing in disbelief. The other half were booing, but the boos were weak. The sheer absurdity of a defense was crumbling under the weight of the documents. You gamed the system. Tulsi continued, her voice relentless. You brought a British citizen into this country, a man who shares your DNA, according to every investigation that has dared to look, and you used a fraudulent marriage to give him legal status, to get him student loans, to get him into North Dakota State University. Tulsi walked to the center of the stage. You talk about the American dream. You are the American nightmare. You are the person who cuts the line. You're the person who breaks the rules that every other immigrant follows. There are millions of people waiting in line legally. People getting vetted. People paying fees. People waiting years to bring their families here. She pointed an accusing finger at Omar. And you? You skipped the line. You lied on federal forms. You committed marriage fraud. You committed tax fraud. And you did it all while lecturing the rest of us about how America is broken. America is broken if people like you can attack me for my family. Omar yelled, tears of rage welling in her eyes. This is about my heritage. In my culture, names are different. You don't understand the Somali naming structure. I understand biology, Tulsi said coldly. And I understand that siblings share DNA. And I understand that you have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees to keep those records sealed. Tulsi returned to her podium and picked up the red folder again. She looked at Martha McCallum. Martha, ask her. Ask her right now if she will release the immigration records of Ahmed, nurse said Elmi. Ask her if she will take a DNA test. Martha McCallum looked like a deer in headlights. She looked at Omar. Congresswoman, these are serious allegations. The documents presented, well, they are compelling. Would you be willing to release the records to put this to rest? Omar stared at Martha. The betrayal was complete. Even the moderator couldn't ignore it. I will not validate a racist witch hunt, Omar stammered. It was the answer of a guilty person. Everyone in the room knew it. Tulsi nodded. That's a no. She looked at the camera. She won't release them because she knows what they say. She knows that she committed a federal crime to get into this country's good graces. And she knows that if the truth comes out, she doesn't just lose her seat in Congress. Tulsi leaned into the mic, her voice a whisper of doom. She goes to prison, and then she gets deported. The word deported hung in the air. It was the ultimate taboo in Democratic circles, but Tulsi had said it. She had laid out the legal pathway. Fraud voids citizenship. Ilhan, Tulsi said, if you lied on your entry, if you lied on your naturalization, your citizenship is null and void. You are a squatter in the House of Representatives. Omar was shaking so hard her bracelets were rattling against the podium. She looked small. The designer blazer looked like a costume. The hijab looked less like a crown and more like a bandage. You are a monster, Omar whispered. I'm a mirror, Tulsi replied. I'm showing you exactly what you are. A fraud, a liar, and a criminal. Tulsi closed the red folder. The sound was like a gavel striking the bench. But the corruption doesn't stop with your brother, does it? Tulsi asked, her eyes gleaming. Family is important to you, especially when it comes to the campaign bank account. She reached for the next folder. This one was green, the color of money. You defrauded the government with husband number 2, Tulsi said, opening the folder. But you defrauded your donors with husband number 3. The screen behind them flickered again. The timeline of marriages vanished, replaced by a spreadsheet. A long, detailed list of payments. Payee, East Street Group. Amount, $2,800,000. Let's follow the money, Tulsi said. The screen behind the podiums didn't flicker this time. It glowed with the steady, harsh luminosity of a bank ledger. The spreadsheet was simple. It had columns for dates, columns for descriptions, but the column that mattered was the one on the far right. The numbers, $2,800,000. The figure sat there in bold black font, hovering over Ilhan Omar's head like a price tag. $2.8 million, Tulsi Gabbard enunciated, spacing the words out until they felt like physical blows. She turned to the audience, her expression shifting from the cold intensity of a prosecutor to the weary disappointment of a taxpayer. We just talked about how Congresswoman Omar defrauded the immigration system with her family. Now, let's talk about how she defrauded you with her lover. Omar flinched. The word lover was uncongressional. It was tawdry. It belonged in a tabloid, not a debate. But Tulsi wasn't playing by the rules of decorum anymore. She was playing by the rules of reality. This is irrelevant, Omar snapped, finding a sudden surge of adrenaline born of embarrassment. My campaign finances are public record. We follow every FEC regulation. This is a smear regarding my personal life again. It became public business when you used public donations to fund it, Tulsi countered smoothly. She pointed to the name at the top of the spreadsheet, East Street Group. For those who don't know, Tulsi addressed the camera. The East Street Group is a political consulting firm. It is run by a man named Tim Minott. She paused, looking back at Omar. Who is Tim Minott, Ilhan? Omar stared straight ahead, her jaw locked. I'll tell you, Tulsi continued. Tim Minott is your husband. Your current husband. Husband number 3, if we're keeping score. Tulsi walked over to the large screen, her silhouette framed against the glowing numbers. But he wasn't your husband when you started paying him was he? Tulsi tapped the year 2018 on the screen. Let's look at the timeline. It's almost as complicated as your marriage to your brother. In 2018, your campaign hires Tim Minnett's firm. You start paying him hundreds of thousands of dollars for fundraising, consulting, and digital advertising. She moved her hand to 2019. In August 2019, Tim Minnett's wife, a woman named Beth Minett, files for divorce. Tulsi picked up a court document from the green folder, and in that filing, she states explicitly that her husband admitted to having an affair with you, with Representative Ilhan Omar. The audience murmured. Affairs in Washington were common, but the details mattered. So, Tulsi summarized, you were married to Ahmed Hersi. Tim was married to Beth. You two started an affair. You were paying his firm millions of dollars in donor money while sleeping with him. Tulsi dropped the paper. It fluttered to the floor. Then you divorce Ahmed. Tim divorces Beth. You two get married in March 2020. She turned to face Omar, her eyes hard. And the money? Did it stop? Did you say, hey, maybe it's a conflict of interest to funnel millions of dollars to my own spouse? Tulsi pointed to the screen. No, it accelerated. After you married him, the payments increased. In the 2020 cycle alone, your campaign paid your husband's firm $2.8 million. They provided legitimate services. Omar shouted, her voice shrill and defensive. They ran our digital program. They produced commercials. It is not illegal to hire family members in politics. It's not illegal, Tulsi agreed, her voice dripping with disdain. It's just corrupt. It's what we call a grift. Tulsi walked closer to Omar's podium. You ran on a platform of getting money out of politics. You scream about dark money. You scream about corporate greed. You present yourself as the champion of the working class. She gestured to the audience. There are people in this room, Ilhan, people watching at home, teachers, nurses, Uber drivers who send you $10, $20, maybe $50, money they needed for groceries, money they needed for rent. They sent it to you because they believed you were fighting for them. Tulsi's voice dropped to a hush. And you took that money and you put it right into your husband's pocket. You turned your campaign into a family ATM. That is a lie. Omar protested, but her eyes were blinking rapidly. We won our elections. The services were real. The profit margin was real, Tulsi corrected. Let's look at the breakdown. She pulled another sheet from the folder. $780,000 for travel expenses. Tulsi raised an eyebrow. That is a lot of travel, Ilhan. And coincidentally, a lot of those trips were to cities where you and Mr. Minett just happened to be vacationing. You used donor money to fund a romantic getaway and labeled it consulting. We were meeting with donors. Omar insisted. You were meeting with room service. Tulsi shot back. The audience laughed. It was a cruel, mocking laugh. The image of the socialist congresswoman living in luxury on the dime of her working-class supporters was too potent to ignore. You see, Tulsi said, turning back to the camera, this is the scam of the modern progressive movement. They sell you victimhood, but they buy themselves luxury. They tell you that America is an evil, racist empire, but they are perfectly happy to get rich off the American political system. Tulsi walked back to the center stage. You paid the largest fine in the history of the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board for your previous violations. And now, you've moved up to the big leagues. You aren't just fudging tax returns anymore. You are funneling millions. I have been transparent. Omar yelled. Everything is reported to the FEC. Reporting the robbery doesn't make it not a robbery, Tulsi said. It just means you're arrogant enough to think you can get away with it. Tulsi paused, looking at the screen one last time. You criticized Donald Trump for his businesses. You criticized everyone on the right for self-dealing. Yet here you are, the biggest hypocrite in Washington. She turned to Omar. You didn't go to Washington to drain the swamp, Ilhan. You went there to build a jacuzzi in it. The line landed like a sledgehammer. A jacuzzi in the swamp. It was the perfect soundbite. This is capitalism. Omar tried to pivot. We paid market rates. Oh, now you love capitalism? Tulsi laughed, shaking her head. When it benefits your husband, you're a capitalist. When it's about the American economy, you're a socialist. How convenient. Tulsi closed the green folder. The brother, the fraud, the money, the affair. She looked at Martha McCallum. Martha, anywhere else in the world, this is called corruption. In Ilhan Omar's district, apparently, it's called social justice. Martha McCallum looked down at her notes. The debate was supposed to be about foreign policy, but Tulsi had effectively put Ilhan Omar on trial for racketeering. Congresswoman Gabbard, Martha said, trying to regain control. You have painted a picture of significant ethical lapses. But I want to pivot back to the core issue of the night. The issue of loyalty. Perfect, Tulsi said, her eyes lighting up. Because the money is just greed. The fraud is just criminality. But what comes next? She reached for the final folder. It was blue. Dark, navy blue. The color of the deepest ocean. Or bruise. What comes next isn't about greed. It's about betrayal. Tulsi looked at Omar. The Minnesota congresswoman was slumped over her podium, defeated, exhausted, her defenses shattered. She looked like a boxer in the 12th round who just wanted the bell to ring. But there was no bell. You asked earlier if I was questioning your loyalty, Tulsi said softly. You asked if I was questioning your patriotism. Tulsi opened the blue folder. I'm not questioning it, Ilhan. I'm denying it. She signaled the booth. Cue the Al-Qaeda tape. The studio monitors flickered to life one last time. The image was grainy, archival footage from a local public access interview, years before Ilhan Omar had the polish of a Washington consultant. She sat in a chair, younger, more unguarded, talking about her college terrorism class. The audio crackled through the speakers. When the professor said Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah, on screen, Omar raised her hands. She curled her index and middle fingers. Air quotes. She made air quotes around the names of the deadliest terrorist organizations on the planet. You sort of like added this very complicated nuance. The video Omar continued, leaning back with a smirk. And then he described terrorism as when victims of Western imperialism decided to do something. The clip ended. The screen went black. But the image of those fingers, curling in a dismissive, mocking gesture, burned into the retinas of everyone watching. Tulsi Gabbard stood perfectly still. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at Omar. Air quotes, Tulsi said. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it sounded like a scream in the silence. She walked slowly toward Omar's podium. Al-Qaeda, the group that flew planes into the Twin Towers. The group that bombed our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, incinerating hundreds of people. The group that beheaded Daniel Pearl. Tulsi raised her own hands, mimicking the gesture with savage mockery. And you give them, air quotes? Omar looked sick. I was discussing the professor's definition. I was talking about how language is used to. You were laughing. Tulsi cut her off. You were treating them like a concept, like a joke. Tulsi's voice hardened into steel. Hezbollah, a group that drove a truck bomb into the Marine barracks in Beirut. 241 American servicemen died in their sleep. Crushed, burned alive. She took another step closer. To you, they are victims of Western imperialism. To me, they're the people who killed my brothers. I have always condemned violence. Omar cried out, her voice cracking. But we must understand the root causes. We must understand why people are driven to. Stop, Tulsi commanded. Just stop. She turned to the audience, her expression one of utter disgust. Do you hear it? Do you hear the difference? When she talks about America, she calls us a machinery of death. She calls us colonizers. She calls us racist. There is no nuance. There is no context. Just pure, unadulterated hatred. Tulsi gestured back to Omar. But when she talks about terrorists, when she talks about Al-Qaeda, suddenly it's complicated. Suddenly, they are victims. Suddenly, she needs air quotes to distance herself from the reality of their evil. Tulsi walked back to her podium and tapped the blue folder. This isn't an isolated incident, Ilhan. It is a pattern. It is a worldview. You view America as the villain of the world story, and you view anyone who attacks America as a misunderstood hero. That is a lie. Omar screamed. I love this country. I took an oath. Did you? Tulsi asked. Let's check the tape on that, too. She signaled the control room. Let's go to your speech in Minneapolis. The one where you spoke in Somali to your base. The one you thought we wouldn't translate. The video played. Omar was standing on a stage, surrounded by Somali flags. She was shouting passionately in Somali. The subtitles ran across the bottom of the screen in stark white text. The U.S. government will only do what Somalians in the U.S. tell them to do. They must follow our orders. The clip jumped forward. We are Somali first. We are Muslim second. We are Americans somewhere down the list. The video froze on her face, flushed with nationalist pride for another nation. Tulsi looked at the frozen image. Somali first, Tulsi repeated. She turned to face Omar, who was now staring at her shoes, unable to meet the gaze of the woman destroying her. You stand in the United States Congress. You draw a salary from the American taxpayer. You enjoy the protection of the American military. And you tell your constituents that you are Somali first. Tulsi shook her head slowly. That is not representation, Ilhan. That is infiltration. The word hung there. Infiltration. It was the accusation that had been whispered on right-wing blogs for years, but hearing it spoken on a main stage by a combat veteran gave it a terrifying legitimacy. I am proud of my heritage, Omar shouted, trying to rally. Just like Irish Americans. Just like Italian Americans. Why is it only a problem when a black Muslim woman says it? Because Irish Americans don't cheer for the enemies of America. Tulsi roared back, her composure finally cracking to reveal the warrior beneath. Because Italian Americans don't make air quotes for the people who bomb our cities. Tulsi grabbed the sides of her podium. Let's look at the country you are so proud of versus the country you spend every day attacking. She hit a button on her iPad. A star chart appeared on the main screen. Let's do a side-by-side, Tulsi said, her voice dripping with cold facts. Somalia, a failed state, ruled by warlords. GDP per capita, $447. Life expectancy, 57 years. Women's rights, non-existent. Religious freedom, 0. If you're gay in Somalia, you are executed. If you're a Christian in Somalia, you are hunted. She pointed to the other side of the chart. United States of America, the leader of the free world. GDP per capita, $76,000. Life expectancy, 78 years. The only country on earth where a refugee girl can arrive with nothing and become a congresswoman. Tulsi walked away from the screen and stood directly in front of Omar. You fled that hell, Tulsi pointed to the Somalia column. You came to this paradise, she pointed to the USA column. And yet, you hate us. You despise us. You spend every waking moment trying to turn America into Somalia. You want to bring the same tribalism, the same corruption, the same hatred that destroyed your homeland and plant it here. Tulsi's eyes were wet, not with tears of sadness, but with the intensity of her patriotism. Why, Ilhan? That is the question every American wants to ask you. If America is so racist, if America is so evil, if America is an empire of death, why did you come here? And more importantly, why do you stay? The question echoed in the studio. Why do you stay? I stay to change it. Omar cried, tears streaming down her face now. I stay to make it better, to force it to live up to its promises. No, Tulsi said softly. You stay because the life you have here is impossible anywhere else. You stay because you like the freedom to hate us. You like the luxury that our imperialism provides you. Tulsi walked back to the center of the stage. She stood on the Fox News logo painted on the floor. She looked like a judge delivering a sentence. You asked me earlier about my service. You call me a war criminal because I deployed to Iraq. Tulsi unpinned the American flag from her lapel. She held it up. It was small, glinting under the lights. I wear this because I believe in what it stands for. I have buried friends draped in this flag. I have folded this flag and handed it to weeping widows. I know what this flag costs. She looked at Omar. You use this flag as a doormat. You use it as a tissue to wipe your feet on while you cash the checks it affords you. Tulsi took a deep breath. The climax had arrived. So, I have one final question for you, Congresswoman Omar, and I want you to answer it. No talking points. No Islamophobia deflection. Just the truth. Tulsi leaned forward, her voice low, intense, vibrating with the weight of the moment. When you go to sleep at night, do you pray for America's success? Or do you pray for its downfall? Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Omar opened her mouth. Her eyes darted left, then right. I pray for justice, Omar whispered. That's not an answer, Tulsi said. I pray for a world where... That's not an answer, Tulsi shouted. Whose side are you on, Ilhan? I am on the side of humanity. There is no side of humanity when terrorists are blowing up children. Tulsi's voice filled the room. There is us, and there is them. There is the Constitution, and there is Sharia. There is freedom, and there is tyranny. Tulsi pointed a finger at her chest. You chose my side. I put on the boots. I carried the rifle. I took the oath. She pointed a finger at Omar. You took the oath, too, but you crossed your fingers behind your back. Tulsi turned to the camera. America, look at her. Look at her silence. Look at her inability to say, I want America to win. Look at her refusal to condemn al-Qaeda without nuance. Look at her refusal to show her marriage documents. Tulsi paused, letting the final verdict land. She is not a representative. She is a saboteur. She is an enemy combatant in a pantsuit. The crowd didn't cheer immediately. They were too stunned. The brutality of the takedown was absolute. Tulsi had stripped away every layer of defense. The race card, the religion card, the gender card, until all that was left was a shivering, exposed fraud. Tulsi placed the flag pin back on her lapel. She smoothed it out. I'm done, Tulsi said, closing her folder. I don't debate enemies. I defeat them. She turned her back on Ilhan Omar. For the first time all night, Ilhan Omar looked small. She looked down at her podium, at her useless notes, at her vibrating phone. She knew it. The consultants backstage knew it. The millions watching at home knew it. It wasn't just a debate loss. It was an eviction notice. The red light on camera 1 finally blinked off. For 3 seconds, the studio remained in a state of suspended animation. Then the dam broke. It didn't start with applause. It started with a roar. The kind of sound you hear in a coliseum when the gladiator finally drives the sword into the sand. The veterans in the audience, men and women who had sat stoically through years of being called racists, colonizers, and warmongers by the woman on the left, rose as one. It was a standing ovation that felt less like a politeness and more like an exorcism. Martha McCallum tried to sign off. Thank you for joining us. This has been, but her voice was swallowed by the wall of noise. She gave up, taking off her earpiece and looking at her producers with a mix of exhaustion and awe. She knew what they had just captured. This wasn't a debate. It was a historical document. On stage, the contrast in the exit was the final piece of visual storytelling. Ilhan Omar didn't wait for the handshake. She didn't wait for the post-debate pleasantries. The moment the light died, she snatched her papers, leaving the damning timeline of her marriages on the podium forgotten in her haste, and turned for the wings. Her movements were jerky, frantic. She almost tripped over a cable, her heels skidding on the polished floor. Her security detail rushed to surround her, forming a human shield not against physical danger, but against the crushing weight of the eyes staring at her. She looked small. She looked huddled. She looked guilty. Tulsi Gabbard stood fast. She organized her folders. She capped her pen. She picked up her iPad. She walked to the edge of the stage and shook Martha's hand. Then, she turned to the audience and gave a single, sharp salute to the veteran section. The noise redoubled. USA! 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 The chant started in the back and swept through the room, drowning out the frantic whispers of the Democratic strategists who were already on their phones, screaming for damage control that would never come. Backstage, in green room, the atmosphere was funereal. Omar burst through the door, tearing the microphone pack off her belt and throwing it against the wall. It shattered, sending plastic shrapnel across the expensive catering table. She had the documents. Omar screamed, her voice raw. How did she have the documents? You told me they were sealed. You told me the marriage file was buried. Her campaign manager, pale and sweating, leaned against the wall. She must have had a PI in Minnesota, or a leak in the court. Ilhan, she had the receipt for the fine. Fix it, Omar yelled, pacing the small room like a caged animal. Call CNN. Call MSNBC. Tell them it was a hit job. Tell them she doctored the photos. Tell them she's working for Assad, working for Putin. Just get the narrative back. The crisis consultant, the man who had smelled of expensive cologne and arrogance just an hour ago, sat on the sofa with his head in his hands. He looked up, his eyes hollow. It's too late, Congresswoman. What do you mean too late? He turned his laptop screen toward her. Look at Twitter. Omar looked. Her face went slack. Hashtag whose side are you on was the #1 trend in the world. Not just the US, the world. Below it, hashtag Ilhan exposed. Below that, hashtag brother husband. Below that, hashtag some people did something. The clips were already viral. The air quotes moment had 4 million views in 10 minutes. The marriage timeline chart had become an instant meme, with people adding their own captions. Game of Thrones, Somali edition. We can't spin this, the consultant said quietly. You can't spin DNA. You can't spin a spreadsheet. You didn't just lose the debate, Ilhan. You became a punchline. Omar stared at the screen. The comments were scrolling so fast they were a blur. She hates us. Finally, someone said it. Deport the fraud. Tulsi just ended a career with a binder. I'm a Democrat, and I'm disgusted. She married her brother. For the first time in her life, the shield of identity politics had failed. Calling Tulsi a bigot in the replies was getting ratioed into oblivion. The victim card had expired. The next 72 hours were a bloodbath. If the debate was the execution, the days that followed were the display of the body. Fox News ran the special on a loop. Tucker Carlson devoted his entire monologue to the brother-husband chart, laughing his signature high-pitched laugh while dissecting the timeline of Ahmed Elmi's entry into the United States. It's not just fraud, Tucker told his audience of millions. It's contempt. She thinks you're stupid. She thinks she can marry her sibling, defraud the IRS, funnel $3 million to her lover, and you won't notice because you're too afraid of being called a racist. Well, Tulsi Gabbard wasn't afraid. Even the mainstream media, the guardians of the establishment, couldn't ignore the blast radius. The New York Times ran a headline. Gabbard raises serious ethics questions in contentious debate. It was soft, but it was there. They couldn't bury it. The evidence was too tangible. The Washington Post. Omar faces renewed scrutiny over marriage documents. Politico. The squad in crisis. Democrats distanced themselves from Omar after disaster. And distanced themselves they did. It was the most brutal part of Washington politics, the silence of your friends. Nancy Pelosi was asked about the debate during her weekly presser. She adjusted her glasses, looked over the rim, and said, "The Ethics Committee will do its work. We expect all members to adhere to the highest standards. No defense. No, we stand with Ilhan. Just the cold, bureaucratic hand of doom." The squad tried to tweet support, but it was half-hearted. AOC posted something about misogyny in politics, but deleted it 2 hours later when the comment section became a deluge of people asking about the $2.8 million to the husband. They knew. They were rats, sensing the ship was listing. They weren't going to drown for her. The most damaging blow, however, came from the law. 48 hours after the debate, the FBI announced they were reviewing the new evidence regarding the immigration status of Ahmed Elmi. The Minnesota Campaign Finance Board announced they were reopening the case on the tax returns. It was the domino effect. Tulsi hadn't just won an argument. She had handed the prosecutors a roadmap. 1 month later, Tulsi Gabbard sat on her porch in Hawaii, watching the sun dip below the Pacific. The ocean was calm, a stark contrast to the firestorm she had ignited. Her phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Breaking. Rep. Ilhan Omar announces she will not seek our re-election. Tulsi swiped open the article. The statement was the usual political drivel. Family reasons. Focusing on mental health. Exploring new ways to serve the global community. But the subtext was clear. She was quitting before she was expelled. She was running before the indictment came down. It was a plea deal with the American public. I will go away if you stop looking at the DNA test. Tulsi set the phone down. She didn't smile. She didn't cheer. She took a sip of her coffee and looked out at the waves. It wasn't joy she felt. It was relief. The mission was accomplished. The enemy within, the ideology that viewed America as a sin to be expunged rather than a nation to be improved, had lost one of its loudest generals. She thought about the thousands of messages she had received in the last month. From soldiers in active combat zones sending selfies with Team Tulsi written on their helmets. From Jewish families in New York thanking her for saying what they were too afraid to say. From legal immigrants who had waited 10 years to get their citizenship, thanking her for defending the integrity of the line they stood in. They had been waiting. They had been waiting for someone to stop apologizing for America. Tulsi stood up and walked to the railing. The American flag she kept on her porch fluttered in the trade winds. It was faded from the sun, fraying slightly at the edges, but it was still bright, still whole. Ilhan Omar had asked, "What is America?" She had called it a place of injustice, a place of cruelty. But Ilhan was wrong. America was the place where the truth, no matter how buried, eventually claws its way to the surface. It was the place where a soldier could stand on a stage, unarmed except for a binder of facts, and defeat a machine built on lies. It was the place where, in the end, loyalty mattered. Whose side are you on? Tulsi whispered to the empty air. The wind caught the flag, snapping it proudly against the pole. Our side.